I'm pleased to introduce Jordan Cohen, who I've known for a number of years. He's been in a number of places. I've known him when he was, I think first I met you when you were at IBM.
Right.
He also was at IDA. He's been at SRI. He's entrepreneurial. And currently, I'm pleased to say he's on our advisory committee at the COE. And so, with no further ado, Jordan.
Thank you. Morning. When I came up for this meeting that Rich is having right in the middle of the big speech meeting, so lots of speech people are in Portland. Can you guys hear me? Is this okay?
Yes,
you can or you can?
we can.
Okay.
We're using HMM, so we can't comprehend.
So Rich said, well, why don't you come give a talk? And it turns out I'm an independent consultant, and I do some work with some small companies, and I'm doing some legal stuff. But I'm also 20% time at Berkeley, although I just moved to North Carolina. So it's sort of a long distance thing. But this thing at Berkeley started before I moved, and it's an outgrowth of some work by Steve Wegman and Larry Gillick from Nuance. I knew them when I hired them into Voice Signal several years ago. Both really smart guys. And they had been working on trying to figure out why hidden Markov models performed the way they did. So this is not a diatribe against hidden Markov models. If that's what you thought the title meant, it's not. However, I'm doing a survey of how people feel about hidden Markov models. By people, I mean people that work in speech and language technology. And almost to a man, the brittleness of the systems that we build with this technology is unmanageable. So we really need to do something different. And I don't know how to do that. I don't have any solutions here. But we're looking at some diagnostics. So I'm going to tell you about these diagnostics, about the stuff we did. And I think I'd like to talk with, I grew up at IDA as a professional. And at IDA, we had two rules about talks. One is anyone can leave at any time, so if it's dull, please. And the second is anyone can attempt to reorder the talk at any time. So I'm happy to live by those rules. So this is the Ouch team.
Party outside.
What?
There's a big party outside.
Hey. Nelson Morgan is the principal investigator of this little, this is a seedling from IARPA. And Steve Wigman, who was the acoustic modeler at Dragon for many years, and then came to work for me at Voice Signal. Then I hired him at Cisco, and now we hired him at ICSI. So he and I sort of have been hopping around together. I'm the co-PI for the breadth survey. I'll tell you about that. And we have a couple of postdocs. So this began in March this year. We didn't realize it, but if you're going to ask people questions, you have to have human subjects approval. So we went through the whole deal. And this comes from a discussion that Nelson Morgan and I had with John Garofalo. John runs a lot of the speech stuff at NIST. And we met in downtown Washington for a meeting years and years ago. And John said, I'd like to figure out a way to get the government to spend some more attention on why speech recognition isn't making any improvements. Wegman and Gillick have been looking at statistical resampling, which is a technique to sort of impose characteristics on systems that you didn't have, that they didn't have, but you'd like them to have, and see what happened. And there was some original NSF money, and there's a paper. It's listed in the abstract of this talk, so it's easy to find. If you can't find it, drop me a note. And we're looking at acoustic modeling. So we're using this basic resampling stuff, which is a technique from statistics. And Ouch is taking some very early NSF work, which was reported on, and extending it to more difficult speech recognition tasks, where signals are noisy, or the signal and the training come from mismatched sets. And we're looking also at slightly different front ends to see what happens. So what we're doing is we're building diagnostics. Now, I'd like to think that these diagnostics have some element that will tell you how to build better models. And I would love to think that that's true. We haven't done that, and that's not part of this study, but hopefully you'll get some ideas about what to think about. And at the same time, I'm looking to figure out what the community actually thinks about the technology, and we're looking at people who know a lot, and they're going to tell us what's going on. If you read the literature, everything looks wonderful. I mean, we keep making these advances, and you see bigger and bigger numbers. But if you dig a little deeper into that, you'll discover that the technology is nowhere near as nice as we make it out to be in our literature. So we're trying to actually nail that down and figure out what people's opinions are. So we have an in-depth study, that's the resampling stuff, and a breadth study, which is the survey. So we're going to specify a task, and we're going to use very simplified versions of HMMs. Typically, we have sort of 5,000 or 6,000 states in an HMM that we're going to use with either single Gaussians or sums of 8 Gaussians as the acoustic model. And we're going to try to make data that satisfies the assumptions of the Markov model. Now, Markov models make lots of assumptions, in particular about independence. And it's not inherent to the Markov model that you have to have this kind of stuff, but the models that we use do have these kinds of characteristics. So we're going to look at the kinds of models we're actually using. We're going to generate data by resampling, and then we're going to look what happens as we take away those statistical assumptions in the resample data. So here's, for you that need a reminder, here's how hidden Markov models work. We think about speech as being, in your head, a sequence of words. And each of those words has a sequence of phones. In this case, W1 is represented by 2 phones, B, if you like. And each phone is represented by a sequence of states. And each state has an output distribution. It's a generative model. And that output distribution makes some outputs. These outputs can be MFCCs, or they can be other things, collections of other observations that we put together with a multi-layer perceptron, or they can even be a function of a lot of time. But this is the basic idea. So, this is the sort of the standard model that's used everywhere in the current speech recognition systems. There's 2 assumptions. One is these little state models produce frames, and we assume that successive frames are statistically independent. Now, they're conditionally independent, but they're independent. And then frames from one state are really independent of frames from the next state. We also assume that when a state produces frames, it produces observations. It produces them from a stationary distribution. That is, the frames that come early are the same as the frames that come late. So there's no change, there's no trajectory associated with those frames. Frames are not very long. Typically, a phone is 10 or 15 states, and a state is typically 3 to 5 frames long. So they're not greatly long things, but we assume that they're stationary. That is, the distribution that describes the output is the same at every point.
Why are we talking about when we have we didn't talk about the Gaussian mixture, so that's the mix all of that stuff happening. So that's this kind of discussion. I mean, this argument doesn't make sense at least to me.
Well, so we're using mixtures. We're using 1 or 8. So that's what this model is. It has either 1 mixture or 8 mixtures on top of Melkepstra. So
that captures all the mixing, all the menstruation ideas supposed and all that.
well, you'll see. You'll see. Hey, stick with us for a minute. So we want to know if we can attribute the recognition errors to the mismatch between the data and the assumptions, right? However you do that. So how do you do that? Well, one thing you can do is you can force align the test data. So I have this speech recognizer. I'm about to recognize this sentence. I'm going to sort of cheat. I'm going to align the sentence. And so I know that means that at each frame I have a label associated with that frame. And then I'm going to throw away those observations, and I'm going to go find an observation that matches the assumptions of the model, and I'll show you how to do that. And then we're going to replace all of the observations in our test data. Then we're going to throw away the fact that we knew what the labels were. So now we just have these observations. And we can build observations that match the model. And now we're going to look to see what happens. That's the idea. And we're going to try to use that as diagnostic. This stuff was... So we walk through the state level alignment and produce frame by frame observations. Now, I'll show you about resampling, but the first thing we're going to do, the first thing that Larry and Steve did was they built these observations from the distributions of the model. They just used them to generate the observations. So in this case, the generated observations actually match the model. And they're doing independent calls on the model to generate these observations. And so they have something that could have been generated by the model, although it has the right phonetic characteristics. So we have a pseudo utterance. And the pseudo utterance is the same length as the original utterance, frame by frame. It satisfies the hidden Markov model assumptions. MFCCs are usually 39 long vectors, where you have vectors and deltas and delta deltas. And the deltas are sort of continuous across the distribution. We've given that continuity up for this purpose. We just treat them as numbers. So we're going to generate them, but we're not going to enforce the continuity. And that turns out to be okay. Now I want to talk about what happens when we resample. So one thing, I told you how we generated this data from the model. Now we're going to generate it from the data that produced the model. And here's the general idea. You have a big block of data that's our training data, and we're going to cut it in half. Half of it we're going to use to make a traditional hidden Markov model. The other half we're going to label. That means we know the transcriptions, we can label the data, and now for every frame in this other block of data, we actually know what the label of that frame is. And then we're going to take all of these labeled frames and we're going to collect them by the label. So for instance, this might be an E. And every place that there's an E in this training data, in the second block of data, that's different from the data that we used to make the recognizer, every place there's an E, we just take the observation and we plop it in that bucket. So that becomes the E bucket, and the U bucket, and the A bucket, and the Sh bucket, and so on. So we have buckets of observations that come from the phonetics of the training data, of this sort of intermediate data. And then what we do is we do the same trick. We take the test data, we align it. Now we have a label associated with each frame in the test data. And we throw away the observations. And so this label is an E, right? And so what I do is I now make a new observation by going to the E bucket and drawing one at random with replacement. And the next frame over is an E, and I go to the E bucket. And the next frame over is an U, and I go to the U bucket, and I draw one with replacement. And so I have all of these observations that actually were things that we observed in this second corpus. And now, again, we throw away the labels and do speech recognition on that stuff. And so now this stuff matches the actual distribution of the data. So we've given up the imposition of the probability distributions that we had in the model, and we're matching the actual distribution, the empirical distribution. So that's sort of the game we're playing here. And drawing this game of buckets, we don't have to do frame, right? So you can think about building a bucket of states. So I can label the data, and now I can build state buckets. So I have a state that's the beginning of the E, and the state that's the middle of the E, and the state that's the end of the E. And I put in there observation collections that came from the beginning of an E or the end of an E. Or I can even build other buckets that are the whole E, right? So I can build phone buckets. Or I can build word buckets. And so I can do resampling by drawing from these buckets at the appropriate level. So if at frame levels, I'm enforcing independence between frames. At state levels, I'm enforcing independence between states, but not between the frames that are internal to the state. At the phone level, I'm giving up even the state independence, and so on. So we're relaxing the independence of the data in a sort of straightforward way, from a little to a lot. So that's sort of what this says.
Sure. Could you quickly review again what you do about deltas?
We ignore them. We
They don't contribute to the scoring?
They do. But we don't enforce the fact that deltas are related from one time to the other.
What are they deltas of?
They're not deltas of anything. They're just numbers from the distribution that was either modeled by the model or that were in these frames. They're just numbers that are associated with those frames. They're not deltas anymore. They're just numbers.
But aren't deltas a way of overcoming the independence assumption in the first place?
Well, that's an assumption. We'll get to talk about that. So you would have thought so, but I think the answer is no.
When you're talking about labels, that's always based on so someone gave you an HMM system, and you always do a viterbi decoding with that system.
Right.
Not like a human. Is there?
No. This is no. This is when I talk about label here. This is from an alignment.
Okay.
So I understood what the word string was, and I used my system to label it. Right, but it's given that word string that I already knew.
So it's like force alignment.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. It's first alignment.
The training and tests that you're talking about, those were not used to actually train that system.
The training was a different system, on independent data.
You're getting confused with the notion of training test. That train is not for the HMM.
I've taken remember I took my original data, the training data, and I used half of it to build a system. So that training was that. Then I took an additional half and I used it to build buckets. That half has speakers which are independent of the first half, but it's not clear what training means here. But I built buckets out of that stuff. Okay.
You use the force alignment, the second packet.
That's right.
The alignment is done
The alignment is done using the first recognizer
from dictionary pronunciation.
and the dictionary pronunciation. That's correct.
Cheating kind of the second.
That's right. That's right.
Doing the right.
Cheating, kind of, and we'll get to talk about that some. So in the first studies that these guys did on the NSF, they used Wall Street Journal and conversational telephone speech, and we're going to extend that to some other stuff. But in our in-depth study, we're going off to look at meeting data, and we're looking at different front-end features with different kinds of temporal alignments. So we're going to look at more interesting data. The meeting data has a large block from ICSI and a little bit created at other places. And there's a good sampling of different kinds of acoustic phenomena, but only a few speakers are represented in the majority. And so it gives us some trouble. These are details about how we did the corpus, so I'm not going to go into. Essentially, we're going to be using the ICSI data. So here's the acoustic model. We're using crossword triphones with 5,000 states, and we're going to use unimodels and 8 mixture densities. And for the language model, we just use a big language model that's fixed, that came from an SRI language model on meeting evals. And now what happens? Well, here's some results. So the results are sort of interesting. One of the things that happens is when you simulate data from the model, and then, so we simulated the observations that came from each frame, and then just laid it down and then threw away the fact that we understood the labels and submitted that new set of synthesized data to the speech recognizer, we do pretty well. We're sort of in the 3-4%. There's Wall Street Journal switchboard and the meeting corpus. So the meeting corpus is this one. So this is actually using the distribution from the model. It's absolutely the same as the model. In this case, we use the empirical distribution. That is, we sampled actual things that were in buckets. And now we do not quite so well. When we give up the independence between elements of a state, now we have a new thing, which is length. The length is no longer constrained, because you can take something that's 3 and replace it with something that's 5. So, and so we've given up the independence between the frames to make states, and now we do less well. And doing phones, we do less well. And doing words, we do less well. And this is the real data. But this stuff is really a surprise. It's spectacularly well. What I say to people is we reduce the error rate by 95%. Now, that's a diagnostic. I can't build you a system like that because I had to know an alignment for the test data. But it is certainly thought-provoking that these kinds of differences happen as you give up the independence assumptions.
You didn't run HLDA after the MFCCs.
No, but we've run some stuff with using perceptrons, MLPs. I don't think it has any effect here. Well, we'll talk about it. Hang on to that. So these are consistent with the earlier results. And the biggest thing was frame to state level. And we think it's the inability to account for independence that's driving this whole observation. So we wondered.
You're selecting data to do your model.
Yeah.
Kind of plus minus, which HLDA also would do kind of the same thing.
Okay. Well, we can talk about that.
Okay.
So we wondered if it was the fact that we're using unimodal mixtures that was really the story here, and so we thought we'd try some a more sophisticated model. So we used eight mixtures, and now we're just looking at the meeting data. And so here's the data on 8 mixtures. Now for the real data, we see just what we expect. That is, the 8 mixture models have an error rate that's lower than the real stuff, than the unimodal mixtures. And that's true in the word data, and it's true in the phone data, and it's true in the state data, but it's not true in the frame data and the simulated data. This made us scratch our heads. We're wondering what was going on. And it took us a while to figure out what was happening. And I won't describe it in detail, but there's a modeling mismatch that was hidden in our setup. And the modeling mismatch was that when we use the 8 long distributions, the 8 Gaussian distributions, we had separate simulation and recognition models, and they have state tying, and the state tying is done data dependently. So the state tying in the 2 models was inconsistent. So that accounted for this increase in the error rate of the 8 Gaussian models. So I won't do this in detail, but it turns out that if you force everything to be the same model and you fix the state tying, then we actually have a consistent story. So we were able to clear this up, and it all had to do with the sort of the mechanics of how we were doing the model, and not with anything that was thought-provoking, although it did take us a while to figure it out. So we're starting to look at clean recognition and noisy data. That is, you build a recognizer on clean data, and now you look at noisy data. For the meeting data, we have parallel stuff. We have close talking and far talking microphones, so we have matched near field and far field data so we can actually do these experiments. And what happens is, if we take the far field data and build a speech recognizer and do this whole rubric, then the data looks pretty much like that. But if we build the near field data and build a model and then label with the far field data, that number goes, the first number goes from 0 to about 20. So the mismatch actually bothers us a lot, and we're just beginning to understand what's going on there. So we're just looking. Okay, well, so that's, yeah, this is just telling you what I just said. So we're starting to look at these more serious problems. And we're going to look at different features, Gabor features and MFCC features, and we're starting to look at features that are not taken from 1 frame, but from 8 frames or 9 frames. And there'll be some interesting data.
So can we pause for a moment? I want
Sure.
to see if I understand if I've got the right intuitions here. When you have 20 frames updated with the independence assumption, then you've got lots of data that allow you to identify the phonemes that are involved. And those data are orthogonal, so
They're independent.
they're independent. And so if it really is not the phoneme E, then some of those frames are going to be incompatible with E and are going to allow you to rule out that phoneme. But in real data, when you run this, you think you have 20 frames, but those frames aren't independent of one another. So
Right.
effectively, you have a lot less data
Right.
to be able to identify the phoneme. Is that what's going on?
That's, yes, that's certainly part of what's going on. The hidden thing I didn't tell you was there's an implication. You know, there's this magical parameter that you need to make speech recognition work that you shouldn't have to have, and it's a language model weight.
Right, and the language model weight is compensating for this. Because
Sort of.
The problem is that the HMM's independence assumptions don't necessarily mean that the ranking of outputs is going to be wrong, but it's going to be overconfident.
Right.
Because it thinks it's getting it.
So I would say it compensates for it badly. But it turns out that the difference between having these independent frames and having the dependent frames is that the language model weight, where with the dependent frames has to be 15, with the independent weights has to be 4. They're quite different. So it certainly shows up. And so that's consistent with what you just said. Okay, so these are results on a single distant microphone. They're essentially what I just told you. And we were pleasantly surprised that this was still going on.
One more question. Is it possible, I mean, it's really hard to estimate the actual number of degrees of freedom, but if you say that, what you was mentioning, like if they're independent, effectively you have more information.
Yes.
So if you have a way to estimate, let's say, instead of having 20 bits of information and I actually have 5, then in your sampling, you sample with 5 bits, you get like matching performances, because I'm concerned that the real reason why you have this thing is not because of the independence assignment, it's because you got more data.
It's even worse than that. So the fact is that the marginal distribution in our resample data for an E is always the same. And that's not true in the real data. They're quite different. So we've imposed a homogeneity on the data that's not really true. So there are lots of effects here, and we're just starting to tear them apart. So let's say we don't understand all of them. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the other part of this study, and that is, I told you I was surveying the community to find out what people really thought about how things work. That's called the breadth study. So we wanted to figure out what the community was thinking. So we're only looking at acoustic modeling. There's lots of action in the rest of the model. So we're going to do some literature searches, but mostly I'm going to talk to people. I've talked to some of you. So I'm polling. Fred Gay is a polling guy. He's a statistician, and his specialty is snowball sampling. So we wanted to get as close to an independent survey as you could get about what's happening in the community. I know a bunch of people, but they all think like me, so that's not a good sample. So we have this snowball sampling going on. Nancy Jameson is a consultant. She's starting with a different focus than me. She's from the industrial community. She does IVR systems. And we're talking to a whole bunch of people. And we want to learn what people think. about recognition and what they've tried. And so in snowball sampling, what you do is you start with a small core, and then for each person you say to them, well, who else should I talk to about this stuff? And you just follow your nose. And what happens is you get to talk to a lot of people that you wouldn't have thought of. And also, you don't tell people who you've talked to, so as the survey goes on, eventually the recommendations fall back on people you've already talked to, and when they all fall back on people you talk to, you're done. So it does have this closed-off property. We probably won't get that far, but we're already seeing that happening in our survey. Sorry? Yeah, it's fun. So we had to do the IRB stuff, and here's the questionnaire. So there's a 12-question questionnaire. I'll show you a couple of interesting questions. Did I skip one? Here's the questionnaire. Okay, early in the questionnaire, it's about demographics. So who are you? The IRB rules for the survey is we have names and we can follow the names during the survey, but when we get done, we have to erase everybody's name. So there's no names associated with answers in either the reporting or in the survey. And so this is the first really interesting question. Right. So we asked people where the current technologies failed, and we got some interesting answers there, and I'll show you some. And then we try to get people's analysis of places where things have failed in the speech technology in general. And the next question, the second one from the top, is actually the most interesting question. So what have you tried to improve in this technology or applications that should have worked but didn't? That is, we're trying to ask questions about how people think they understood the technology, but were incorrect about how they thought. And I think that will be a pretty revealing question. And then there's this one, which is the snowball. So we're currently about 70 people into this 100-person survey. So it's still continuing. We have a pretty broad range, although it's bimodal in this sort of interesting way. We have a bunch of old guys and a bunch of young guys. We don't have any 25s in here, but so these are people that have been around the industry for a while. And we do have some 75s, which is sort of intriguing. And people have been in the field for a long time. So there are a couple of youngsters at the left, but mostly they've been around for quite a long time. We asked for kinds of experience they've had, and we asked people to sort of self-classify themselves. We asked things like research in academia or management in industry or whatever. And these are what these self-classifications look like. So in academia, which is the blue bars, almost everybody represented themselves as in research. But in industry, almost everybody said they were in development. So there's essentially no research going on in industry according to people's self-classifications. And industry has the bulk of the management stuff, and there was a little bit of academia. And then these guys are analysts and business development folks and people who are sort of on the side but pay attention to the field. I think that's pretty much what you would have expected. This is the first substantive slide, and this is why did things fail? What's wrong? What's broken? And this is sort of a surprise, I think, but I think it's consistent with what we see in the world. Speech recognition and its associated technologies are brittle. As soon as you go outside the domain of the training, they fall apart. And they fall apart in ways that people don't expect. So it leads to systems that work not well enough and that fail in very unpleasant modes.
Why do you say the training? Why don't you say more broad? I mean, it's not really training. The reason City fails for me is because I'm asking questions that City was never really envisioned to be able to answer.
Well, that's what I mean by the training. I mean the environment as well as the data. Yeah, the domain. We've been unsuccessful in really making recognizers better in noise. People complain they just don't work well enough. Some people think that we don't have good models. They sort of think that that's at the guts of everything. And we don't deal well with acoustics. So it's sort of the things you expected, except this brittleness is really pervasive. And people really are uncomfortable with it and haven't been able to fix it. We're going to do literature. This leads us to this kind of literature stuff. That's just where we're going to look. It's not done. This is the other interesting question. What do you try to do that failed? So you'll notice if you sum up the column, it doesn't sum to 70 people. So these are every category that had more than 2. So this is a very long-tail distribution. And the story here is, except for pronunciation, which lots of people have tried and no one has gotten to work, we've tried everything under the sun. Everything you can think of, well, almost everything you can think of, to fix the speech recognition systems in general has been tried and doesn't fix them. So I would say we're stuck. So where are we? Well, we're about 2/3 of the way done with the survey. And models don't work. And people have told me that systems are too complicated and too simple. And by that they mean they're too complicated because the cost of entry to actually working in this field is too high. There's too many things floating around. The systems are too big. They require too much computational resources. And they're too simple because there's lots of phenomena that you can talk about in the speech that they don't model. So we haven't captured the data, and we're spending a huge amount of effort to not capture it as well as we do. I think that's sort of an interesting way to look at it.
I think more than nuance, IBM and Dragon systems, building smaller systems, many more people for the specific domain.
Yeah, but they still don't work.
Well, we need more of those.
Back to the causes questionnaire, one more.
This one?
So, yeah, who decides on the categories? Because it seems to me that about 4 of these are maybe the same thing.
Yeah.
Who separates?
So when you do a survey like this, you basically, we were warned off by Fred of doing the categorization before we did the survey because it doesn't work. So these categories come from Fred and Nancy and me sitting down at a table and looking at the elements and trying to figure out a categorization. This is not the final story. So
You got causes and effects mixed up, and you got
Yeah.
one person's noise is another person's robustness.
that's right. That's right.
Acoustics is not different from noise unless you spell it out and tell somebody.
Right. So this is quite a literal categorization. We just tried to take the thing that people said and put it in one of these categories based on what's written in our database. So, well, we're not done. I mean, this is really preliminary, and we need to deal with this issue. So the caution is well taken.
Are the long form responses available?
So, I'm sorry?
If Jack wanted to read the long form response.
Oh, we'll give him everything. He can have them. They're not very long. They're entries in a database, but there are a lot of them. So, yeah, we'll publish, at least to the sponsors, all the data except the names.
Also, were these mutually exclusive? Can someone have complained about multiple things at once?
Yes.
So in some sense, I guess what you're really looking at is the margin.
That's right. That's right. We didn't restrict people to complaining about one thing. That was a good question. Thank you. So we're getting results in this in-depth study that are sort of at least thought-provoking, and we hope that they'll lead us to analyze things in a way that'll show us how to make better models. And we're trying to make sense of what the community intellectual status is with respect to this technology. Now, the hidden agenda, if there is one, was John Garofalo's original charter to us. And he said, I'd like to find some support for the government to put money into the basics of speech recognition. And so I think there's a chance that this survey will lead to that kind of to stuff that will support that kind of effort. So we're trying to give him positive information that will let him say, gee, speech recognition is stuck. Here's some evidence that there's a lot to be gained if you do it right. How about putting some resources here? So I think that's where we're headed, I hope. This is a one-year seedling. It ends in March next year. So anyway, that's what Ouch is about.
So I guess what you really point out for us is really understanding the data, basically.
Well, the fact is, what I'm pointing out is the data that we have doesn't match the models that we're using to analyze it.
That means that we don't understand.
Well, or you've been done the world short shrift by using shitty models.
But if we did understood obviously that these are shitty models, we would have to come and fix them.
Maybe not. I don't know. And so I don't know what the solution is here. But we do definitely see that the models and the data don't come from the same world. Yeah. So the answer now is different than the answer in 1960. In 1960, you needed very simple models to do anything. Now, we're not constrained by computation. We're at the place where Google is using 2 centuries of speech data to train their models, which don't work very well. And we still have plenty of computation left over. So there's no, as far as I can see, there's effectively no constraint in the models. The constraint is on building something that works, that you understand. If you give me something that works, that I understand, I can build you a simple one. I use people like you to do it.
No, but I mean, I think it's the understanding of the
So I've always been able to get a factor of 1,000 on processes, or even more.
So you talked about the amount of training data constraining what you build. Which are you thinking?
No, not anymore.
Sorry?
Not anymore. I said.
Well, constraining or not constraining, but there's also the structure of the model. So, you know,
right.
I think Suju might have been asking, are we using HMMs or HMMs of a particular order for computational reasons, rather than using globally normalized models or nets or whatever?
The answer is we were, and many people still are, and those globally normalized things don't seem to make very much difference. I mean, I think they're pretty disappointing.
But the computational problem there is not necessarily in decoding; it might be in training.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
Once you start using neural nets, you have it might be the model is much better, but you can't find the parameters. You have to do grid search, and you can't do it.
That could be. That itself is a failing, but I agree, I haven't attempted to sort that out. So there's still that open issue. I don't know what happens if I have a model that I can never compute, that I can never train. It's not very helpful to me. So
we might still be computational.
I don't think so. You know, any model that uses sums of 64 Gaussians as a distribution is completely brain dead. This is just rubbish. So I think the observations are rubbish, and I think the modeling is rubbish. I think we can do better.
There is things that we know for sure, and I don't know how many people use Siri. I use Siri, and as long as I was using it here next to my ear, it worked very well. The moment I was in a real situation, driving and trying to find a gas station, and I had to use it to get hands off with the car, he would give me, I don't know, he would talk about my ankle and my
so,
you know, no, I want a gas station.
So I'll tell you the reason for that, if you want to know. The reason is that your iPhone 4 had a chip from Audience,
Oh, yeah, no.
and it does noise suppression.
Very well.
And if you hold it up to your ear, it uses a model.
I know that.
If you put it in front of your face, it uses a different model.
Exactly.
And the second model doesn't work very well.
And so I say now, going back to your problem, if you ask me what is the problem is that the community has been solving their own problem all along. They've been solving the problem of speech recognition instead of sound recognition.
Yeah.
We should be doing sound recognition, and speech is a class of sound.
When you have the answer, you let us know. When you find the solution, you've got to tell us. Okay, I think I'm done. Anybody else got any more questions? Thank you very much.